I remember the first time I noticed the nameplate change. It was a Tuesday in late October. Seattle had that kind of damp, honest rain that makes people slow down and speak softer. I was running late, as usual, because my mother had called with some small crisis about the cat, and I'd stopped for a coffee and a scarf. I pushed through the glass door of the marketing floor, and the fluorescent hum seemed louder than it should have been. People were at their desks, screens haloed with spreadsheets, campaign boards, confidence. I ducked my head, avoided the elevator crowd, and walked the long corridor past the meeting rooms. My office was right at the end, the corner one with the view of the Sound when the clouds parted. I liked my office because it felt like a small promise, light when it arrived, privacy when I needed to think. The nameplate on the door read, Claire Hammond, Claire Hammond. 3 letters away from my own name in the company directory, and a lifetime away in everything else. I smiled reflexively, like you do when you see a mistake on a mail form and you assume someone will correct it. Everyone makes a typo. I pushed the door open, expecting the quiet hum of my phone docking and my little succulent, and instead found Claire sitting at my desk, removing my coffee mug and placing a caramel swirl latte where my travel cup usually sat. She looked up as if she had every right to be there. Her hair was the careful kind of sophisticated, the kind that says, I have had this look planned for weeks. And she wore my sweater, the one I'd recommended for a talk at SXSW. She smiled this slow, practiced smile, and for a beat, I felt the easy confusion of being in someone else's story. Morning, Claire, I said. My voice found the polite edges of the sentence. This is my office, she blinked. She thought for a second. Then she said, Oh, I know, Mia. I booked use of it for the presentation prep. Mia. She used my name with the warmth of someone staking a claim. The way she said it turned my name into an assertion. She had been at the company a year less than me. She reported to the same VP. She smiled at the same people in the same way, but louder, as though volume could be a substitute for authenticity. That morning, small things started to consolidate into a pattern. My calendar had meetings labeled with her initials. The draft for the Greenwood campaign, my campaign, had edits in a font that suggested it had been proofed on a different machine. My Slack had threads where she'd responded with the same temperament as the boss, sharp, decisive, and, oddly, informed about things she'd never asked me about in the months we'd worked together. Did you make any changes to the Greenwood deck? I asked her, handing over the laptop. She shrugged. Just a few edits. Tightened the narrative. You were always good at ideas, Mia. I just clarified. She said it like clarification was an act of charity. There's a kind of small intimacy in offices. You trade in the currency of shared jokes, late-night emails, the stories of weird neighbors and childhood scars. We traded those things for months. Claire had arrived with a portfolio of carefully curated sympathy. She'd had a tough upbringing, divorced parents, a dog named Gus. She posted the right brunch photos. She knew the right charities. She asked the right questions. People leaned in. More importantly, our boss leaned in. Within 6 weeks, the promotion I'd been told to expect, the one that had been in motion since my last review, was assigned to Claire. The announcement came in the Monday email, the kind you don't open until you have 5 minutes and a quiet cup. I remember reading, We're thrilled to announce Claire Hammond as Senior Brand Manager for North America. Her strategic vision and tireless work on the Greenwood Initiative were invaluable. Her picture was the one from her LinkedIn headshot. White teeth. Impossible lighting, a gaze that said the camera owed her nothing. The email landed like a clinical report. They cut out the messy parts, the months of me drafting the Greenwood strategy, the nights I'd sat in my tiny apartment rehearsing a pitch like an actor rehearses lines. The morning my mother had called to say the cat had eaten beans and I almost dropped the deck. All the memory that was mine became footnote. They made it official, neat, and public. Claire was the one with the title. Claire was the one who had strategic vision. You learn, in the cold hours after a betrayal, that anger is a toolkit. It sharpens your focus or it fractures you. I chose tool. I sat in my apartment and cataloged. I wrote down every meeting, every email chain where I'd circulated a draft, every copy of a slide where my phrasing that had once required 7 rewrites and a coffee, was now attributed to Claire. I printed them out because paper feels like evidence the way a screenshot does not. I taped them to the wall of my bathroom like a strange, logical shrine. Versions, timestamps, odd phrasings that belonged to me. That was the first week. I told myself the right things. This is temporary, this will be corrected, your work is superior. But there is a deeper truth. Trust is the currency workplaces run on, and Claire had started laundering my currency into hers. She didn't just take the promotion. She softened my contacts to her voice. Clients began to praise her in emails with the kind of warmth reserved for people who had shared private strategic triumphs. "Claire, brilliant presentation," said one. "Claire, loved the direction," said another. Each one felt like an erasure. People assumed it was a petty rivalry. The outside looked neat. Two women in a competitive field, ambition and results. And it was that, in part. But what wound tight inside the tightness was something else. Claire had started being me in other ways. She took my mannerisms in meetings, mimicking the small verbal cadences I used when I wanted to sound confident. She adopted my wardrobe cues. She even, I would later learn, had convinced my boyfriend, or perhaps I should say my ex by then, that he and I had been distant. How do you fight someone who has become the version of you that other people prefer? How do you push back against a narrative that's already been made more desirable than the truth? I started small. First, I reclaimed my frame. The morning after the promotion email, I walked into a meeting and refused to be steamrolled. Claire began to shepherd the conversation toward platitudes. I cut in with the metric insight no one else had quoted, the consumer behavior graph that had kept me awake for 2 nights. I spoke slowly, as if telling a story at a dinner table, and the room leaned toward my voice the way people lean toward a familiar narrative. For a second, I could see the glint of recognition in the VP's eye, the eye that had once seen me as the team's leader before it began to see Claire. But it wasn't enough. People believed patterns. Claire had made a habit of appearing first, of answering emails immediately with confidence. I would send a note to the client at 8 p.m., and in the morning there would be a forwarded email praising Claire for being on top of it. The narrative inertia was heavy. If I wanted to win, I had to choose battlefields she could not predict. There's a strange clarity that comes when you let yourself plan like someone playing a long game. I refused to react like someone humiliated. I refused spectacle. Wrenching myself onto the moral high ground was tempting, but I had learned life is rarely a moral OTT. So I decided to be practical. Find the seams in the fabric Claire had woven. Everyone threads their persona. Everyone leaves behind evidence. I began collecting in a more deliberate way. I set up folders, digital, encrypted, with versions of my work labeled with dates. I saved timestamps of drafts. I made a habit of sending a brief confirmation to anyone who'd met me in a decision-making capacity. "Thanks for meeting today. Per our discussion, I'm circulating the deck with X, I, Z, little anchors that would later be difficult to remove from the thread. I started CCing the VP on crucial emails. I made visible the scaffolding of my own achievements. The second part of the plan, and what made it feel like something darker than just corporate maneuvering, was to leverage psychology. Claire's performance relied on collective assumption that she was authentic. If I could seed enough doubt in the right places, colleagues would start to see the seams. The first seed was harmless. I posted a piece of writing in the company forum, a thoughtful piece on consumer trust in brand narratives, that myself and Claire had been drafting in different forms. I published a version so clearly written, so identifiably my voice, that anyone who had read my work could see the fingerprint. The post went mildly viral internally. It was shared across teams, and in subsequent meetings a few people referenced Mia's post when someone made a point Claire had been claiming for weeks. Claire's smile thinned. It was barely perceptible, the way moth wings bristle. She began to show her teeth less when she saw me. There was friction now. Those small public reclamations were important. They nudged the office to remember the origin of certain ideas. But to win, I needed leverage. Something undeniable that would make it impossible for her to recast history as she wished. And leverage demands information. So I started to watch, not in the stalking, melodramatic sense, but with a focused, legalistic patience. I observed behavior in meetings. I read email headers. I noticed where she sent drafts from. Some came from her personal email late at night. Others came from shared devices. One day I noticed a copy of the Greenwood deck in the cloud with metadata older than her hire date. Metadata is a quiet companion that does not lie. I printed the metadata. It was clumsy but factual. IP addresses, edit timestamps, a version history that suggested the Greenwood deck had been iterated greatly before Claire's edits. I had a body of evidence slowly forming under my hands. What I did next might be the part that will make people call me cold when they later read the story. But it was also the moment I felt the most honest. I began to feed Claire small, controlled lies, and watch which ones she ate. There is an art to gossip when your goal is to reveal truth. You don't scream. You whisper a plausible detail to a trusted colleague that you already know will spread naturally because it fits the room's expectations. In our office, the rumor mill favored the dramatic. A seed like Claire confided that she plans to pivot Greenwood to emphasize influencer strategy would spread and then be contradicted by an innocuous fact. Oh, Mia's been testing micro-influencers for months. The contradiction made people curious, and curiosity is a sieve. It lets through the truth when the other person attempts to replicate it. I told an ally, Hannah from Analytics, a thing I knew would be believable, that I had an alternative deck that included an original consumer insight. The goal wasn't to deceive, but to test. If Claire acknowledged it publicly or attempted to claim the credit, she would show either a duplication of behavior or something more. She would reveal where her information truly came from. 2 weeks later, in a cross-functional meeting, Claire stood up and presented the exact insight I had mentioned to Hannah, word for word, data point for data point. My stomach dropped as if out of an elevator shaft. It should have been an adrenaline spike, but instead it felt like the slow tightening of a noose I had loosely tied myself. In those moments, you can make a choice, confront and create spectacle, or continue to gather. I chose the latter. I had learned, over years in marketing, that people respond to narratives more than to data. Toxic narratives, like the one Claire had been building, feed on repetition and plausibility. My job was to redirect the narrative without shame, to be strategic in the way I exposed the inconsistency. So I started planting small corrections in public spaces. An email thread that referenced the insight was CC'd to our VP with a short note, noting the insight Hannah and I iterated in last week's draft, happy to share the version. I began to take the stage in meetings with a kind of steady light, measured, disarming. I stopped doing knee-jerk accusations. I leaned on documentation. I spoke in specifics. That strategy worked. Slowly, colleagues began to double-check. Hannah, when asked later in a hallway, confirmed my account in a way that felt casual and human. Mia's the one who noticed the microtrend with Gen Z. When no one was looking, these small moments accumulated like coins in a jar. But the thing about a long game is that it's exhausting. It asks of you a stamina that is both physical and moral. At night, I would lie awake, rehearsing what evidence to show and when. I'd practice a calmness I did not always feel. My hands would sometimes tremble when I printed another document. And then, about 3 months into Claire's takeover of my public persona, everything pivoted. I opened my email that Monday morning to find a single message in bold from legal with the subject line, Urgent, Potential IP Misattribution. The email was terse. Please review attached for potential intellectual property misattribution pertaining to Greenwood campaign assets. We requested a copy of your original files for comparison. My heart raced, but this time it was the speed of someone ready for exercise, not panic. The legal office was neutral ground. It was an arena where evidence could speak louder than charm. I replied with calm professionalism and attached a folder with dates, timestamps, and the metadata that meticulously mapped the evolution of the Greenwood materials. There is a surprising dignity in documentation. The documents didn't care if I had a racing heart or trembling hands. They simply existed in time. They carried with them a history that couldn't so easily be smoothed over by a confident smile. Legal called me in for a meeting that week. Claire called it a fishing expedition when I bumped into her at the coffee machine, and she laughed it off with that same winning half-smile. She asked me, varnishing her curiosity into faux concern, if I was okay. I said I was fine, and meant it with all the teeth of truth I could muster. The legal meeting was quiet. Many chairs, a long table, the kind of fluorescent sympathy that makes corporate rooms feel like interrogation chambers. There was a woman named Priya who led the legal team. She had an efficiency to her voice that made the air thinner. I handed over a printed packet, then sat back and watched the professionals do what they do. Parse claims into categories, assess reputational risk, decide whether the matter warranted escalation. When Priya asked me to speak, I did not get theatrical. I told the story in the voice I had been cultivating, measured, precise, the cadence of someone who knows when a pause can be more persuasive than a rush. I explained timelines, showed versions, pointed out where metadata contradicted public statements. I named facts without venom. Legal's response was cautious. They could not, and would not, pronounce guilt on the basis of my packet alone. They needed corroboration, email threads with Claire acknowledging authorship, client emails praising her directly, perhaps an admission. But they took the matter seriously. They would review internal communication and, if warranted, request a meeting with HR and possibly the VP. When I walked out of the room, I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because something that had felt like a private nightmare had been turned into a formal inquiry. I had taken my hurt and put it into the language institutions understand. That week, office gossip shifted from cruel to curious. Claire's posture tightened into something less silent and more performance. She began to micromanage in public, perhaps hoping to crowd out any doubt with the loudness of competence. She used my phrasing in emails in such a way that it felt like mimicry. People noticed. They started to hedge compliments. The VP held a one-on-one with Claire that seemed longer than usual. I watched their body language on the other side of a glass wall and saw the brief fissure of concern in the VP's face. But Claire was not stupid. She felt the pressure and responded with a counter-strategy of her own. She escalated charm. She invited junior staff to lunch and made each interaction memorably warm. She posted a LinkedIn halo narrative about the Greenwood win, complete with team photos and taglines that read as if she had written them herself. The narrative needed to be smoothed, and she smoothed it publicly. I could have confronted her in the hallway, screamed the truth in a way that might have felt righteous. Instead, I decided to use what she had used against me, public perception. I arranged a small, internal workshop, Transparency in Creative Ownership. It was a non-threatening title, something that sounded like a professional development seminar. I pitched it to the VP as a morale-boosting initiative. He agreed. The idea was simple and honest: to educate the team about attribution, version control, and the ethics of collaborative work. It would be framed as best practices, things we should all be doing to prevent confusion. The subtext was tactical. By making attribution best practice, I could create an environment where blurred lines were no longer acceptable. The workshop was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. I spent the week building a deck that was tidy and factual, peppered with real-world examples, disguised enough to avoid litigation. I rehearsed the talk in my kitchen at midnight, stirring tea and turning over the rhythm of phrases like stones. I wanted to be clear and disarming. I wanted people to see the small mechanics that turned one person's work into another's credit. On Friday, the room was full. People came for the free snacks and stayed for the details. I walked through file histories, showing how easy it was for work to be appropriated in the modern day. A missent email, a copied document, a convenient retelling. I made the argument that systems can reinforce fairness if we set them up. At the end, I introduced a simple policy proposal, a transparent versioning protocol, mandatory CCs for key decisions, and a clear sign-off procedure for campaign materials. The VP in the back nodded. Claire watched me with a gaze that combined calculation and anxiety. After the workshop, people came up to me with small confessions. "Oh, I didn't realize how easily that could happen. I'll start CCing more." Hard to keep track with so many handoffs. These were tiny concessions, but they were the language of shifting power. Claire was quiet that afternoon. She looked at me and said nothing as she left. I thought of the first time I'd seen her at the door, smiling in my sweater like some small imposter of my life. I felt a kind of satisfaction I had not allowed myself to name. But winning is not simply about setting policies and making people aware. To truly reclaim what she had taken, I needed to do something more. I needed to make Claire's duplicity visible, not merely through policy, but through a moment that no one could ignore. A moment that would force the company's hand. I began to look for the soft vulnerabilities in Claire's public persona. Everyone has one. Her vulnerability was the thing she never realized. She prized narrative above fact. She believed that if she told a story loudly enough and often enough, people would prefer the story to the truth. It's a strategy that works until it doesn't. The opportunity arrived in the most mundane way. A client, a boutique apparel brand we loved, requested a last-minute pitch revision. They wanted a shorter deck, more punch, and they wanted it within 48 hours. The VP sent out a request for volunteers. Claire, hungry for the chance to shine and collecting opportunities like trophies, volunteered publicly on Slack. She wrote, "Happy to take lead and deliver a sharp version by EOD tomorrow. Excited to showcase our strategy. It was a perfect opening. I volunteered too, not as a competitor but as a collaborator. I offered to take the consumer insights and tighten the messaging. The client accepted. We worked late into the night. We were in the same room, a conference space with a projector and the kind of stale coffee that tastes like commitment. Claire was there, as always, presentational. She had a notebook with neat margins. In between slides, she smiled at the client in the way of someone auditioning for sympathy. At 2 a.m., we finished. Exhausted, we left the office with the kind of camaraderie forged by shared deadlines. Claire texted the VP at 3 a.m. "Pitch deck updated and finalized," she wrote, attaching a final file. She CC'd no one else. I had my own copy. I kept a version history, a trail. The next morning, the client praised Claire in an email that started, "Claire, brilliant, crisp, loved the revision." It was the sentence that would later be looked at with cold fascination. She had taken the public victory and carved it into the record. I felt a familiar tightening, but it was different now. It was the tightening of someone who had the patience to apply pressure slowly. I did not call the VP and make accusations. I prepared instead, behind the scenes, a strategic reveal. I scheduled a lunch with the client under the guise of deeper debriefing. I asked thoughtful questions. What in the deck moved them? What felt original? What needed more air? Their answers gave me subtle confirmation that the idea they'd praised had been, in fact, seeded earlier by me in a white paper I'd posted to the company forum. The client had seen the earlier thread. They had been charmed by Claire's delivery, but had also remembered the original insight. I left that lunch with 3 things: a confirmation from the client that my fingerprints were on the work, a sense of the client's opinion that delivery and origin could be distinct, and a plan. The plan was not to create theatrical justice, but to accumulate reputational truth in places that tolerated evidence openly. Legal, client testimonials, internal records. The VP convened a small meeting to discuss the client's success story. He asked Claire to present. She did so with the ease of someone who had practiced victory like a script. When she finished, I asked to add a point. I'd like to note the consumer insight thread that initially informed our messaging. I circulated a version in September, and the client referenced similar phrasing in our debrief. It was a casual footnote, and yet it was a public correction in the room. Priya from legal sat up. The VP made a mental note. The client, visiting via Zoom, nodded. Small ripples. Claire's expression, for the first time since I'd noticed the nameplate, faltered publicly. She tried to smooth it, to reframe. "Mia did excellent groundwork," she said, as if offering me a rosebud instead of an apology. It was a gentler version of theft. The person who steals sometimes praises their own theft for appearance's sake. When the email thread of the meeting hit my inbox that night, I CC'd it to legal with a short note. For the record, here are the initial posts and drafts referenced in the meeting. It felt like tucking away a relic. The week after that, legal called Claire in to talk. I did not witness the meeting. I do not know what was said behind closed doors. But I know what followed. Claire began to change. She called in sick more often. She stopped scheduling public wins. Her LinkedIn posts grew less frequent, and when she did post, the language felt curated, strained. The energy that had once been confident now read like someone hoping the performance would hold. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no collapsing moment with sobs and furious words. There was a slow erosion. Public lines were corrected, social credit rebalanced, small acknowledgments shifted. The office started to adopt the procedures from the transparency workshop. People CC'd and documented in ways they had not before. If you are a person who believes in poetic justice, perhaps you expect the villain to fall at the end of a monologue. This was not that fall. It was instead a dismantling of a scaffold. Claire's advantage had been built on the scaffolding of informal practices and unchallenged assumptions. When the company reinforced its structures, the scaffold could not be used without oversight. One evening, almost as if the universe enjoyed irony, Claire left her phone on a meeting table in the break room. I noticed it as I walked by. There was a message preview. PR, can you share the post with my edits? I'll take the credit. The words were mundane, banal, the kind of thing you might see if you watched a person unspool themselves in private. But where it landed, for me, was as a proof. She lied on purpose, not out of oversight. I felt a strange mix of triumph and pity. Triumph, because the last evidence I needed had arrived not as a dramatic confession, but as an honest message in plain text. Pity, because I could see, in a different life, how someone becomes convinced of their right to another person's story. That weekend, I made copies. I printed emails and saved the texts. I sent a brief note to legal. I believe I have additional evidence that clarifies authorship. They responded with procedural coolness and asked me to forward the material. A few days later, HR requested an informal meeting. Claire sat across from me, her posture defensive for the first time. She looked smaller than she had when her nameplate first appeared on my door. There was no theatrics, no shouting. The conversation was human and brittle. "You were wronged," she said finally, with a softness like an apology that never quite reaches its mark. "I didn't mean—" I thought I was filling a gap. "Why did you use my voice?" I asked, because there is a point where you stop abstracting and you need the bluntness of a question. She hesitated. "Because it worked," she said. It was not a justification. It was a confession the way a wound is a confession, raw and factual. The HR person steepled their fingers and suggested a cooling-off period and mediation. I felt the arc of the story bending in my favor, a slow gravitational pull toward restitution. When I left the room that evening, I walked through the city, and the rain felt different. It no longer seemed like a force that softened edges, but like a clean sheet you could fold and put away. The nameplate on the door that now bore my name again, not because a fight had exploded but because processes had been reasserted, felt like a small mirror. It reflected the person who had learned, in a corporate ecosystem that often values flashover truth, to be patient and meticulous and, yes, a little ruthless when necessary. Part of me wanted to believe that the story would end cleanly, that legal would close the file, that Claire would quietly move on, and that I would be restored. But I had learned to read the arc of stories. Restitution is rarely a single act. It is a sequence. You win one battle, and then you must secure the peace. You make a public correction, and then you must decide whether to forgive or not. Sometimes, victory creates responsibilities you did not anticipate. So I prepared for the long work ahead, rebuilding trust with clients, reclaiming the narrative publicly, and deciding how much of Claire's story I would make public and how much I would let remain a private reckoning. I scheduled follow-up meetings with clients to clarify authorship and started presenting at industry panels again. I used my regained platform not for vindication, but for education, transparency, attribution, and the ethics of collaborative creation. The nights still came sometimes with the same ache. I would sit at my kitchen table and watch the rain make maps on my window, thinking of all the small ways identity can be borrowed and stolen, and of the thin line between seduction and theft. I held on to my evidence like a compass while I navigated the aftermath. Each small success, an emailed apology, A corrected press release, a client's direct commendation, felt like a tiny stitch in a garment I'd been trying to repair. The story was far from over. Claire's presence still hummed in the background like a poorly tuned radio. People remembered the moment differently, some with indignation, some with ambivalence. Some wondered if the entire conflict had been blown out of proportion. But the thing about truth is that it is patient. It does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it simply refuses to be erased. On a Tuesday, 3 months after the nameplate incident, I walked past the door and glanced at my reflection in the glass. The city lay beyond in the soft gray brilliance of a sky that had cleared. I felt the small, fierce warmth of someone who had reclaimed her name, not by shouting, but by steady insistence. Winning had not been a final cinematic act. It had been a series of small, strategic moves: documentation, patience, public education, targeted exposure, that collectively made it impossible for a lie to hold. It had required that I become the kind of person who could keep a calm voice and a file of evidence, who could be both meticulous and morally unyielding. It had demanded a kind of sacrifice, the slow erosion of a simpler faith in people, replaced by a wary confidence in systems and prepared documents. I did not hate Claire. I watched her leave the company months later with a quiet professional departure email that thanked people for the opportunity and growth. The line felt neat. People sent polite replies about wishing her well. The world, in its infinite indifference, allowed many stories to coexist. But the part of the story that mattered to me was this: when someone steals the story of your life, you do not have to shout to be heard. You gather evidence, you build structures, you make truth easy to find. And when you do, the world, slow as it is, will sometimes correct itself. There was more to do. There always is. Repairing reputation takes longer than taking it. That realization was both sobering and empowering. I had won a battle, not a war. If the next chapters were to be written, they would need not only strategy, but generosity, a willingness to set boundaries without becoming bitter, to expose without humiliating, to reclaim without becoming the person I had fought. My phone buzzed, an invite to speak at a local panel on ethical marketing. I accepted. My voice was steady when I replied. The rain outside my window had stopped. The city smelled like possibility. I thought victory would feel louder, but in the weeks after Claire left, the office moved on with the quiet efficiency of a city repairing itself after a storm. Desks were reassigned, emails were redirected. The new intern asked where the extra staplers were, and someone laughed again at the coffee machine. I stayed late most nights, tying up the small loose threads she'd left. When a client wrote to clarify last quarter's deliverables, I'd answer kindly, attaching the proper files. When someone thanked the team, I'd reply, happy to have led the project, gently correcting the record without preaching. It wasn't vengeance anymore. It was reclamation, one polite sentence at a time. Still, something inside me hadn't healed. Because beneath the clean professional surface, I carried the hum of what she had done and what I had become to stop her. You can scrub a record, but you can't fully erase the fingerprints of the fight. At night, I caught myself rehearsing imaginary confrontations. What I should have said the day she stole the credit. What I should have done sooner. And then I'd close my laptop and whisper, "You already won." Let it go, easier said than done. 3 months later, the company held its annual industry summit, a 3-day event downtown with panels, sponsors, and all the people who like to say synergy with a straight face. I was invited to speak on authenticity and brand storytelling. The irony didn't escape me. The very thing Claire had fabricated, authenticity, was now my topic. When I walked onto the stage that morning, I could feel the quiet weight of the audience's curiosity. Some of them had heard the rumors. Some had read between the lines of internal memos. I took a deep breath and began. Authenticity, I said, isn't about how convincing your story sounds. It's about how willing you are to be accountable for the truth inside it. The words didn't tremble. They came out clean and deliberate, the way I had practiced them. For the first time since that office door had worn her name instead of mine, I felt in complete control of the narrative. Afterward, people came up to me, strangers, colleagues, even the VP, and said things like, "That was powerful. You've really grown. You should write a book, a book." That idea clung to me like static. Weeks later, I started writing, not a tell-all, not a revenge memoir, but a psychological case study wrapped in fiction. I changed the names, I blurred the details, but I told the truth where it mattered, about ambition, about envy, about the slow violence of being erased. Writing was its own kind of therapy. Every sentence unspooled a knot I hadn't realized was still tightening around my ribs, and with each chapter, I felt the distance between me and the person who had once needed revenge. I submitted the manuscript quietly, under a pseudonym. 6 months later, a small publisher called. They wanted it. The editor said, "It feels real." I smiled. "It is," I said. The book, Borrowed Faces, didn't become a bestseller, but it found readers who wrote me letters that began with, "This happened to me too," and that somehow felt bigger than applause. Then one afternoon, almost a year after everything, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in months, Claire Hammond. The message was simple. "Mia, I saw your book. Congratulations. I recognized myself in some pages. I think I needed to. I'm sorry. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to delete it. Another part wanted to respond with the eloquence of closure. But what do you say to someone who once lived your life for you? How do you thank a ghost for the lesson it forced you to learn?" In the end, I typed only, "Thank you. I hope you're well," and I meant it. Not as forgiveness exactly, but as a release. That night, I went for a walk through Pike Place Market. The air smelled of sea salt and rain, the same way it had the day I found her at my desk. Street musicians played soft jazz near the stalls. I dropped $1 in a jar, and one of them smiled at me like he knew a secret. Maybe he did. Maybe everyone carries one story they've had to steal back. When I reached the edge of the pier, I looked out over the dark water. Seattle lights shimmered like scattered coins, and I realized revenge isn't about destruction. It's about restoration, about taking what's yours and learning to hold it lightly again. I took a breath, long, slow, deliberate. The kind you take when you know the worst part is over. Behind me, someone was laughing, a couple arguing playfully about who forgot the umbrella. Life, in all its messy forgiveness, went on. A year later, I was promoted to Director of Brand Strategy. When the official email went out, my name was spelled right. And this time, it stayed that way. The team threw a small party, balloons, cake, bad champagne. Hannah from Analytics raised her glass and said, "To Mia, proof that truth has better stamina than lies." Everyone laughed. Even I did. It wasn't triumphal, just peaceful. The quiet victory of someone who had stopped needing to win loudly. Sometimes I still think of Claire. I hear she started consulting for startups, smaller places where charm still carries currency. Maybe she's learned something, maybe not. But I no longer need to know, because the life she once tried to live as me, the calm apartment, the steady purpose, the evenings spent writing instead of plotting, it's mine again. And it's enough. Soft piano _. They say imitation is the highest form of flattery. But when someone steals your life, flattery becomes theft. I took mine back, not with fury, but with proof. Because in the end, the truth doesn't shout. It waits and it wins.